Let's talk about the different XML file types and how they interact. There are 4 types of files that we'll be talking about in this class that we'll be working with inside of XML. The first, well, let me look at them logically. The first is logically, the first in terms of how we'll work with them really is the instance. But logically, really, the first is the schema. The schema is the file that contains all the rules for a model. You begin with some information context or information scenario or some way of putting that information situation. And so in this case, let's take the idea of a composition, the kind of composition that you might do as an essay or as an article or something like that. The schema contains the rules. What exactly is an article? What's our model of an article? How do we think about the article? The schema file contains all the rules that decide whether it's an article or not. An article must have A, B, C, D, and E. That's the scraping, by the way, of people coming off the lift. That's right behind me. So the schema file contains the rules. The schema validates, that's the vocabulary word that you'll know very well by the end of the course, validates an instance file. While the schema file contains the rules of what a composition or an essay must be, the instance file contains the actual composition. So we have one schema file saying what an instance could be. You could give that to you and all your friends, and each one of you would have your own instance file, would say, yes, your file obeys all the rules of what it means to be a composition. So the schema file validates the instance file. Conversely, you would say that the instance file is an instance of the schema. The schema defines the type, and the instance is an instance of that type. Now, if that vocabulary isn't familiar to you, think about it this way. The schema is the mold, and the instance is the thing that's molded. We have a mold, and that mold is designed to produce compositions. And each composition is going to come out of that mold exactly the same because the schema is assuring that each one will be the same. So the schema validates the instance. The instance is an instance of the model that's contained in the schema. Now we have a transform file. So far we have a kind of a closed loop here. You can create compositions or whatever is in the schema, whatever the schema is a schema of. You can create them over and over and over again, and they'll be perfectly they'll be perfectly valid according to that schema, so they'll be great compositions. The only problem is they'll look like XML, and no one wants to read XML. People want to read, for example, a web page or a PDF file or something like that. And so the next file that comes into the equation to make that happen is a transform file. The transform file transforms the instance file to create an output file that's in a format that end users want to see. So let me make that a lot more concrete. We have a schema. The schema defines a composition. We have an instance. The instance is a composition that's valid according to the schema. And now we want to put that composition on a web page. We apply a transform to the instance, and that transforms that XML into HTML. And now we can put that HTML on a web page, and we have a nicely formatted composition. Okay, so the final file there is the HTML file, the output file. The transform creates an output file. There wasn't an HTML file before the transform. There are 4 file types. File type number 1 is a schema. That's the rules file, the mold. File number 2 is the instance. The instance contains actuality, contains the code that is what the schema says it needs to be, in this case a composition. We have the transform. The transform transforms our instance into an output file, and in this case the output file is HTML. Okay, so those are the 4 files we'll continue to work with over and over again. Let me walk you through one more thing, and that's the way that this happens usually on a server. In this class we're going to do almost all of our transforming manually. That is, we'll have a tool and we'll say, okay, transform now. But you can imagine that there's no one behind a website saying, okay, transform now. It's all done programmatically. So let me run through the basic structure of how a program like that works. So we have a web page, and that web page in the example that I've been following is a composition. It has a composition on it. How did that composition get on the web page? Well, I want to create a composition. Here's my XML file. Here's my transform file. Put those together and make me a composition. Right? Of course, I'm paraphrasing the programmatic nature of it, but what it really is doing is if that URL that you clicked on is a set of instructions. It's a set of instructions to the program behind the scenes to do what you're asking it to do. That is, apply a transform to an instance to create an output file and send that output file back to the browser. Okay, so where that's happening usually is in some form of script file. Doesn't have to be a script file, and I won't even go into the details of what it means to be a script file, but you can imagine there's some program, and in this case I'm calling that a script file, on the server. And when you click the URL, somehow that program gets the URL, and from that URL it can figure out what to do. And what does it mean? What does it do? It, first of all, it loads the XML file. That means it finds the XML file from wherever it was on the hard drive of the server and loads it. Loads it means like make it available. Then it validates it, or it should validate it. It doesn't always validate it, but it could validate it against the schema. And if the instance file is not valid according to the schema, then it'll go no further because it's not a real composition. It's not a real instance of that schema. And so validation is the first step to make sure that the transform is going to work and the composition is going to come out the way you want it to. So if that's all correct, if the instance is valid against the schema, now we apply the transform, and we transform the instance into an HTML page. That HTML page then, through the web server, goes back down the pipe and loads into your browser. Okay, so that's kind of a very introductory and non-technical explanation of how XML works on the server. And as I said, except for the very end of this course, and even for some of you then, we won't really be doing it this way. We won't be doing it programmatically. Stuff programmatically.